Okay, welcome. My name is Brad Vogel, and I am the Executive Director of the New York Preservation Archive Project. Now, I know a lot of you in the audience know all about what we do here in New York City, but just as a reminder, I'll tell you a little bit briefly about what our game is. We work to tell the story of the preservation movement in New York City in all kinds of different ways, chiefly through oral histories and our preservation database and programs like this one. And I'm really happy today to have the chance to introduce all of you to our new series. This is our inaugural show in a new series that NIPAP is putting on, which is called Preservation Origins, Stories from Cities Across the Nation. And the focus of this series is a chance to learn more about New York City's preservation story by looking out comparatively at the preservation movement and how it grew and originated and fleshed out in other cities around America. Sometimes to learn more about yourself, you have to look outside rather than inside. So we think that there's a great advantage and a great lesson to be learned by taking stock of different cities' experiences around the country now. Before I hand over the reins here to our MC for the event, I wanted to let you know that there's one really interesting reason why we are taking a look at Charleston, South Carolina first in this series. Now, for one, we have a few connections in the city, and that will become clear as we go through the program. Another reason is that when Albert Bard, who is the gentleman chiefly responsible for getting New York City the state enabling legislation that actually let New York City have its own landmarks law. This was back in 1956 after decades of work. Thank goodness that Albert Bard lived a really long time. But in his survey, in his search for a template that New York City could use to set up a landmarks law, he looked across the country. And one of the places that he looked, this handful of cities, was Charleston, South Carolina. Now, ultimately, Bard did not find that the Charleston model was a fit for what he envisioned for New York City. But as we'll see, Charleston certainly has had a robust preservation group, a set of groups, an environment, an ecosystem really, and an ethic for quite a long time. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over to William Cook.
Thank you so much, Brad. It's great to see everybody here today to help us kick off NIPAP's first talk in our new series, Preservation Origins, Stories from Cities Across the Nation. And I'm especially thrilled that we're going to start with two of my favorite cities, Charleston, South Carolina, and New York City, where I was fortunate enough to live for about 10 years. And it was a very special time in my life. A lot of people, including preservationists, aren't aware of the historic preservation connections between the two places. We're fortunate to have with us to lead the discussion a former colleague and friend, Jonathan Poston, author of the iconic book, The Buildings of Charleston. Jonathan, who's a lawyer, worked in Charleston for decades as a preservation advocate. He will share with us his deep knowledge and experience about the city and the preservation movement's evolution, as well as how Charleston and New York have drawn from each other over the years as historic preservation has evolved. Following Jonathan's presentation, I'm lucky to be joined by Betsy Cahill, chairman of the board of the Preservation Society of Charleston, and Zoe Stevens, vice chair of the Historic Charleston Foundation, will update us about the history of their respective organizations and advocacy landscape in Charleston right now. At this time, I'll turn the floor over to Jonathan Poston. Thank you, Jonathan, for joining us today.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, and I guess we can launch the slides now. Second. excuse me one second. Oops.
On that one.
All right. Charleston and its preservation story is so tied to the fact that it's peninsular and in some ways insular. And as we know, that's often said of New York and Manhattan. And the same is true of Charleston. And I used to show a very decrepit slide in these presentations because it was much more encompassing of the coast around Charleston, of the islands and all the fortifications of Charleston. And the reason Charleston exists is because this particular spit of land was considered strategic to the British, and because it was a place that could be defended from various points and have a protected harbor. So with that said, Charleston is really truly understood by looking at it aerially. I was happy about 10 years ago to go with Jack Boucher, who some of you may know was the greatest American architectural photographer of his generation, and who was with the Historic American Building Survey as their chief photographer for many years. And you can go online and look at these wonderful images of Charleston, and I was with him in the helicopter. I was terrified, but he was snapping these hanging out, and they really do give a sense of this original plan of the city. And it's the plan of the city which was sent over by the Lords Proprietors in about 1680, which was not entirely successful in terms of adapting to the Greek-ridden peninsula, but yet at the same time was very much a part of how Charleston grew, and very much a part of how Charleston has to be peculiarly protected from various changes. Well, you may ask why I'm sitting in this room, and there's an important component to the story that I'm going to tell you about the history of preservation in Charleston that has to do with the woodwork behind me and the story of the demolition of the building this woodwork and this room came from. This is the William Burroughs house, called the Mansion House on Broad Street, built in the 1770s, the product of a great English carver's work in Charleston that was extensively studied by the late John Bivens. And the carving in the second floor front drawing room, which we're in, and if the camera was turned differently, you would see that great Venetian window, which is to my right. All of this was unfortunately slated for demolition in the late 1920s. Here it is in context. St. Michael's, if you know Charleston, St. Michael's Church and its churchyard are immediately to the right, right near the civic square, the four corners of law. And here's the room, here's the mantel and overmantel that are behind me as they were when they were in situ. Well, then why is this room at Winterthur? Well, it's not here because initially of any removal by Winterthur, but it's here because of its being available for purchase at a time when it had not been installed by its original purchaser. The original purchaser, Francis Garvin, many of you know of the Mabel Brady Garvin collection at Yale, which is named for his wife, which was a lot of includes a lot of decorative arts that he collected as well. He purchased this room as the demolition of the Mansion House transpired, and whether the house was torn down because of the woodwork or vice versa is unclear. But Mr. Garvin never used the room. It was never installed anywhere. It's set. And so many Americans in the period of the 20s and 30s, as well as museums, were looking for period woodwork and period rooms. And so this one was there, and thankfully, actually, because it was there, Henry Francis DuPont, you see here, purchased it, and sort of a later bit in the history of Winterthur to install here. And it was installed some years after the principal rooms of the 1920s in a later wing. And the reason I'm in it today, partly is because now it is actually a conference room, very grand one, but it's not a central museum space at this point. So it's a part of the preservation story that these demolitions were starting up in the 1920s. And I should say for a minute that I'm here at Winterthur and working with, and I owe thanks to Carol Perdue, who is the CEO and director of Winterthur and Winterthur Museum, Garden and Library, and also to Chris Strand, who is the estate director, the Brown Harrington director of the estate, who is here helping me with this, launching this presentation today kindly, and who helped arrange this day. But I'm here at Winterthur doing a survey project with them for some months, and it's great to be on site, and it's great to do this presentation from here. Well, there's another tie, and there's another one that I've used before in lectures long before I was here at Winterthur that occurs because of the Preservation Society. And today, or this year, we're marking, as we'll hear from Betsy Cahill, about its 100th anniversary, founded in 1920. And there was a member of the society who was up here in Wilmington, Felix DuPont, who's shown there on the left as a young man. And Felix DuPont was very interested in Charleston, and I actually didn't know this till recently.
Two queens.
Sorry, I actually didn't know this until recently, but his grandparents on his mother's side, Charlestonians, his mother was a native of Charleston, of South Carolina, and from the Simmons family, which I'll get around to that in a minute. But he had close family and ties, and was an early member of the Preservation Society. And he said to the society members in a letter that he wrote them in 1934, "Your society is performing a very important piece of work, but how you have a hard fight against the new Charleston movement, which is being so widely advertised and promoted by the Rotary Club, of which I'm a member, and other organizations that put an increase in commercial affairs and growth of the city above all other considerations. I hope the work of the society will be successful, but I have a feeling that the movement of the people, which carries with it the so-called American idea of progress, and which is producing such astonishing results in Florida, is going to extend northward along the coast. This will mean increases in wealth and the happiness that wealth is able to produce, but certainly very precious manners, customs, and landmarks are going to perish in the movement. If Charleston can preserve its present beauty and attractiveness through the turmoil that is coming, future generations will appreciate what has been accomplished. I sincerely hope the efforts of the associations and individuals who are trying to preserve Old Charleston are successful. I would think an important part of the work to be done would be to find some means of educating the rising generation in the appreciation of existing things that make Charleston and that are threatened with extinction." So a very prophetic message in so many ways from Mr. DuPont in 1934. Well, so many travelers had always remarked about the value of Charleston's buildings and its atmosphere. And in figuring out the history of preservation in Charleston, it's important to understand that it wasn't just Charlestonians who appreciated it, it was travelers and visitors who said extraordinary things about the city and about its appearance. Although this person was a native, this is Charles Fraser, who was a miniaturist and native. He said, "Strangers visiting our city often compare it to an old one in France or Italy." Then Fanny Kimball, who's such a ubiquitous diarist in the 1830s and 40s about America, said even more enthusiastically, "Every house seems built to the owner's particular taste. And in one street, you seem to be in an old English town, and in another, in some continental city of France or Italy." The variety is extremely pleasing to the eye. And it wasn't just those two writers, William Cullen Bryant visiting in 1843, gushed that the spacious houses are surrounded with broad piazzas, often a piazza in each story, for the sake of shade and coolness, and each house stands by itself in a garden planted with trees and shrubs, many of which preserve their verdure through the winter. The buildings, some with stuccoed walls, some built of large dark red bricks, and some of wood, are not kept fresh with paint like ours, but are allowed to become weather-stained by the humid climate like those of European towns. It's a constant thread of this appreciation for this unique atmosphere. And as the 19th century wore on, even in the years after the war between the states, so many writers used Charleston in novels, such as Owen Wister and his book, Lady Baltimore, which you see on the right, and he's more famous for The Virginian. But, and then Henry James devoted his American travel volume, a chapter of it, to Charleston, because he just found Charleston so very distinguished. And he said that he really enjoyed its, or was seduced by its idle, easy loveliness. And he had lots of interesting comparisons, Charleston with Italy. So, so there was all of that. And then there were the Charlestonians themselves. I like this painting because of Henry Bembridge's portrayal of a man and his mother. He's brought home something from his bird hunt. But it's sort of indicative. Again, I usually, if it's an audience in a room, I usually get some laughs with these two because they really are an interesting couple, and they do speak to the peculiarities that are said by these various travelers that are part of the charm as well as the uniqueness of Charleston and its bent towards preserving its patrimony. So Charleston in 1853, this is the hill view of the city from the tip of the peninsula at what had just been developed as what we now call White Point Gardens, looking north. Well, Charleston had a great deal of economic decline. Of course, it was having it before the Civil War, which is not always talked about. But of course, particularly after the bombardment and after the end of the war and during Reconstruction. But Charleston did try various things through a new Chamber of Commerce to try to bring itself back. And in the late 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, in the early beginning, had a Cotton States and West Indian Exposition, a regional World's Fair where buildings like this were temporary buildings were built. And it was hoped, and it did bring tourism to the city, but it was the first sort of aggressive attempt to bring in tourism, but was short-lived. The first stirrings of preservation can be found in 19th century diaries and letters and remarks about important sites. The preservation of churches, for example, St. Philip's Church burned in a fire in 1835. And when rebuilt, it was rebuilt even more aggressively in the Georgian manner than it had been previously, and it was put on the same site. There was that sort of spirit that seemed to value the older buildings and the older settings. This is one of the first two buildings that were attempted to be preserved, and this is the old Powder magazine. It was acquired by the Colonial Dames in 1902. So an effort of that organization that was, of course, there as a corporate, had its mission to celebrate and to preserve and to extol sort of the virtues of colonial antecedents. And the DAR was very active in Charleston as well, with the saving of the old Exchange building, which was first threatened with demolition in the 1890s or actually a little earlier, with the possibility of a new U.S. post office being put on the site. So it was traveling artists, painters, sketchers, etchers, coming through Charleston in the early years of the 20th century that the buildings of Charleston began to be disseminated out from the city itself. That some of these artists, these are two out-of-town artists from the early part of the 20th century, work of some Charleston landmarks. These were very important in the valuing of Charleston. Here's a sale of some of these works in the 1930s on the churchyard wall of St. Philip's Church. And it's all a part of that we begin the real sort of part of the preservation story in Charleston, which begins with this woman. This is Alice Ravenel U.G. Smith. Saying her name is a little bit of a challenge, but she was a Charlestonian of many generations and in antecedents. And she was not a wealthy woman. Her family were fairly limited in terms of means, and she didn't get to study where she wanted to. And she lived in the family house on Church Street, but it was not as it is today, as grand. And she was a very talented painter, and her watercolors became a great souvenir for the discerning and are a great value today for those who've inherited them or bought them at an early period. But her watercolors of the city, particularly of its surrounding marshes and plantation lands and landscapes as well as wildlife, are what are the most prized. And the reason she's so crucial to the story and the intertwining of the artistic pursuits by Charlestonians with preservation is key. And I'm sure in New York and other cities, that's very key as well. I found in my years working in the southwestern US that without the artists in Santa Fe or in San Antonio, that the preservation movements in those cities would not have occurred. And with Miss Smith and her father, D.E. Smith, D.E.U.G. Smith, they produced the very first architectural history book about Charleston. This was published in 1917, The Dwelling Houses of Charleston, South Carolina. And it was some very unique histories of Charleston houses. It was not covering the entire peninsula. It was covering really the sort of grander, earlier part of town, but it also was interspersed plates of engravings of her own work. And this is the Miles Gruden house, which you should note because this will come to the story again in a minute. But this is her particular take on this residence, which she was related to the family of the owners of this house. So anyway, this is the house as it was in about the same period photographically. Of course, this is one of Charleston's greatest colonial landmarks, built in 1772, and its owner lost at sea. And the house has descended through his wife's sister matrilineally and through cousins to the present day, and is Charleston's greatest probably legacy house of the 18th century. And it was here that lived the next figure we need to mention in the history of preservation in Charleston, Susan Pringle Frost, Miss Sue, as she was referred to, who was South Carolina's first woman realtor. She owned the house with her sister, and there is one of her many dogs whose gravestones still dot the garden behind the house. And I find preservationists always have little dogs, or the early 20th century ones had little dogs. Anyway, she was the person who really became responsible for, in some ways, not only the founding of the Preservation Society, but a private preservation movement of her own. As South Carolina's first woman realtor, she was buying houses that might be torn down in Lower Charleston, and she was going out and finding a buyer that she thought might fix it up or might appreciate it. So she was having her own sort of mini revolving fund with downtown houses. But there's a two-edged sword there, because we often say, oh, dear Miss Sue owned this house because there's a balcony on it from another house where she salvaged it and moved it. And she did a lot of that sort of thing. And that's very 1920s in its own way. Well, also tying into the preservation movement in this period is the artistic impulse from not only painting, but also literature and music. And this is a place called often Catfish Row or Cabbage Row. And these two double tenements on Lower Church Street, this is Alfred Hutty, who was a Midwestern artist who came and stayed in Charleston to paint and draw in the spring of the 1930s. But across the street lived a writer named DuBose Hayward, who had already done some significant writing at this point of both poetry and of novels and short stories. His wife, Dorothy Hayward, they had met at the McDowell Colony in New Hampshire and returned to his native Charleston. And he looking across the street at Catfish Row, penned Porgy and Bess, and the two of them together, I should say, and then wrote the libretto for the subsequent opera. George Gershwin, who spent a summer with them on Folly Beach outside Charleston, composing the music. So this is all going on in the 1920s, the 1930s, and this artistic impulse. This is John Bennett, another great writer, but who came from Ohio, and so they were all producing. Another native, but who was very involved in preservation, was Josephine Pinckney, who produced, I think, 9 novels and many short stories. It's a very popular writer in the period of the 1930s and 40s, and writing from her house in downtown Charleston. She became one of the founders, as we'll see in a minute, of the Historic Charleston Foundation. So Prentice Taylor was another out-of-town artist, but an extremely competent, talented artist, as well as locally Elizabeth O'Neill Verner. And Taylor was, for a time, a member of an organization that Miss Verner had helped found called the Charleston Etchers Club. It, along with the Poetry Society of South Carolina, all contributed to this cultural impulse. Well, this is Albert Simmons, who is again a scion of an old Charleston family, related to Mr. DuPont, Mr. Felix DuPont, I mentioned earlier. And I think that letter which Mr. DuPont penned might have been somewhat influenced by a conversation with his cousin, Mr. Simmons. And Mr. Simmons graduated from the University of Pennsylvania School of Architecture with an architectural degree in 1912. And he studied for a brief period in Paris and came back to Charleston and became the single greatest architect influencing the preservation movement in Charleston. And these early people were not just preservationists in theory or whatever, they were also practitioners or writers or people who put together significant volumes. And in this case, the very first volume that was intended by the AIA to be done for every city in America was Charleston, South Carolina, the Octagon Library of Early American Architecture. It's a very valuable book. This is a measure drawing of the Miles Bruton House I was just talking about by Mr. Simmons that's contained in the book. And that particular work was the last of the Octagon Library series. I don't know why, but anyway, the AIA did not produce any more, and maybe because of depression, paper shortages, whatever. But it still is in reprints and still considered a valuable source. But back to a story we started earlier with William Burroughs' house and the woodwork behind me is the loss to Charleston of some other houses and woodwork. This is the Colonel John Stewart house on Pratt Street. One of our commentators has a family member who owns this house today. And it's very important, again, circa 1770 Georgian house. It's major woodwork was lost to the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. And the St. Louis Museum got some as well. That's the room in the Minneapolis Institute. But then there are houses where their woodwork was maybe not reused and taken away, but the demolition caused great travail. And that was true of the Gabriel Manigault House, the house of a great neoclassical architect of the late 18th, early 20th century, whose work is figuring through this presentation, but his own house at the corner of Meeting and George, which was pulled down by Standard Oil pursuant to a plan that happened in so many cities in the late 1920s to build filling stations, gasoline filling stations on corners. So this key corner lot became the site, as did another site on Meeting Street. And although Albert Simmons had fought the demolition of these houses along with other Charlestonians, Albert Simmons designed gas stations for Standard Oil that were considered to be appropriate. And so you can see that some of the elements of the Gabriel Manigault House were reused on 3 of these gasoline stations. And one of them, when I was with the Historic Charleston Foundation, we preserved as a visitor preservation center. It's still in use by the foundation today in another purpose, but it's still there. This is it when it used to be a gasoline station. And Manigault's designed a house for his brother, Joseph, and that's Gabriel Manigault on the left, that was a little bit more uptown, but also was threatened with Standard Oil's purchase and demolition. This was a very significant 1802 neoclassical house. It had been through a lot. It continued to go through a lot for a couple of decades after there were attempts to save it. And it was the saving of the Manigault House that was really the pivotal moment in the occurrence and founding of the Preservation Society of Charleston. Well, another interesting little tie in Charleston between the history of preservation is the history of the women's movement and the suffragette movement. These are the suffragettes of Charleston on the left, lined up on the staircase of the Frost House on Logan Street. And this was the birthplace house of Miss Sue Frost, who's down there in the lower corner, who I've mentioned earlier. And Miss Sue was an organizer, as was Anita Politzer. And Anita Politzer's there on the right, who became the president of the American Women's and leader of the American Women's Party in the 1940s for many years. Ended up living in New York, but she was from, there were 3 Politzer sisters who all had a great influence on Charleston, and particularly various causes, including suffrage. Well, in this period, this is when the Preservation Society and movement are founded. And in 1920, this is a grouping of Preservation Society members right soon after its founding. And the society spent decades virtually trying to save the Manigault House. It had particular problems, there were particular financial issues, raising money was very difficult. And they tried a lot of things, but they were very lucky because Miss Frost leaned on one of her cousins, Nell McCall Pringle, who in turn leaned on her husband to put up some money to keep the mortgage paid on the Manigault House. And sadly, the Manigault House had to still have a gasoline service station in the garden, and it still had to have other things happen, including it was turned into a USO club during World War II. But nonetheless, it was saved eventually by the late 1940s. Sometimes preservation takes a long time, and in this case, it did. But Nell McCall Pringle is looked upon as a great heroine for this. And it's interesting, and this is the house today, it's interesting that the mortgage was finally paid off by Anita Politzer's niece, who happened to be Mrs. Huntington Hartford. Those of you who live in New York know about Huntington Hartford, his architectural legacy, including there at Columbus Circle. And his mother, Henrietta, who by that point was Princess Pignatelli, gave the money to pay off the mortgage and truly save the Manigault House. So the Preservation Society was founded in 1920. So preservation was looking like a possibility for Charleston, at least from the private side, but there was much to do and funds were scarce. And so there came to power a mayor who was very interested in preserving the city. He had a legacy that he appreciated as well. His name was Thomas Stoney. And others on city council and other leaders in the city were interested. So in 1929, soon after the state of South Carolina finally enabled zoning legislation to exist and to be a part of the police powers of cities and towns, the City Council of Charleston retained the Morris Knowles firm of Pittsburgh to do a study and to try to see if there was a way that Charleston could be zoned. Well, Charleston's city seal is often pointed to as a mandate for preservation. It says in Latin, she guards her buildings, customs, and laws. This was the seal adopted in 1788. And it was in this atmosphere that Mayor Stoney, this is him on the left, was beginning to become very interested in doing something no one else had done, which is to take the Village of Euclid case, the municipal police powers of a locality to bear on preservation and preservation of the historic part of Charleston. So if you see down there in the lower right-hand corner of the slide on the right, that's the original Charleston Olden Historic District. And after various tries, after various drafts, and the ordinance was adopted in 1931. It set up the Olden Historic District of Charleston. It set up a board of architectural review that would rule on significant alterations or demolitions, but actually did not have the power at the beginning to prohibit demolition, as is still true in so many American localities. But anyway, the very first chairman of the Board of Architectural Review, I don't have a picture of him, but I have a picture of his book, Colonel Alston Days, who was the authority on the early ironwork of Charleston. And this is his book, which bought today in various forms, but it's still around. And Colonel Days was very much the right person to lead the board. He had been born in San Francisco. He was from a Charleston family, but he'd lived in other places. He was very knowledgeable, but he also was very protective of knowing what Charleston had and that it could be preserved. Well, this is a really fuzzy picture, but the man who's second from the left is the next major player in the Charleston preservation story. And here he is a little bit more clearly. His name was Robert N.S. Whitelaw. And Mr. Whitelaw was the first director of the Carolina Art Association, which was a very old organization, but it's Gibbs Museum of Art, which had been built in the beginning of the 20th century. Mr. Whitelaw brought, as the first professional director, a unique skill set to the museum. He also did something just astounding, which is that he got to know Solomon Guggenheim, who wintered in Charleston, had a house in downtown Charleston, and convinced him to exhibit his collection of modern art, which was a real first. And so Charlestonians in the late 30s got to see Picasso's and other important modern paintings amidst a gallery that usually housed ancestral portraits and landscapes of the 19th century. So the Carolina Art Association became very interested in playing a role as an organization in the future preservation of their city. Starting with a book like this, Charleston Grows, about pointing to good growth and how Charleston should grow, but in wanting to do something more tangible. Some of their efforts were buoyed by other preservationists. We've mentioned Ms. Frost, who was still very much important to this effort, and Mrs. Pringle and others with the society. But another member of the society, Mrs. Lionel Legg, Dorothy Porcher Legg, who you see here on the right, became a sort of private preservation organization of her own, preserving and restoring much of Rainbow Row. It was Mrs. Legg who actually coined the term Rainbow Row for this group of 18th century houses and wharf buildings that remain one of the most important, one of the most viewed images of early Charleston. And Mrs. Legg figured a lot into the preservation of the city from then on. And her husband, who was a judge, Lionel Legg, became very active too in some of the early preservationists that were being promoted by the Carolina Art Association. Well, Mr. Whitelaw uniquely thought it's time to do something even more far-reaching. So he retained Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and his firm from Boston to come to Charleston and to produce, and this is Mr. Olmsted, and to produce this study that took about a year that was a report on Charleston. And it's a tremendous document. I have to say that it was kind of exciting some years ago when the archivist at the Carolina Art Association passed it over to us at Historic Charleston Foundation for our archives. This is it. And it's the pivotal document. Well, I'll go back to that in a minute, but it called for several things. It called for an architectural survey of the city. That sounds kind of passé, but there weren't any at this point anywhere in America. It was a city architectural survey, this was the initial publication of it. It's still in print. And the chief of the committee that included Mr. Simmons and another northern architect who wintered in Charleston, they went through the city and they raided historic buildings, took photographs, and really documented for the future this beginning of a survey of Charleston's historic architecture. And this is Mr. Stoney, and this is Helen McCormick, who also played a huge role as by that point she was the director of Carolina Art. So anyway, all this was going on at the same time that Mayor Stoney was working with South Carolina Senator Bennett Maybank on different ways to use WPA funds to preserve Charleston, the most important of which was the restoration of the Dock Street Theater at the beginning of early in the 1930s. But the Civic Services report had called for more than just an architectural survey, that is the Olmsted report, and different new zoning or planning guidelines. It also called for there to be a new organization that could raise money to do what it termed area rehabilitation. And so it was that this same group that I've been discussing, the Civic Services Committee, called upon Kenneth Chorley, who was then the Chief Executive Officer and President of Colonial Williamsburg, a former lieutenant in the Rockefeller Organization, who came to Charleston and appeared at the Dock Street Theater in April of 1947. And he said, you who live in Charleston have an obligation to encourage the present day Americans to encourage present day Americans to visit your city. The history of our country is their legacy also. You who have the good fortune to make your home here are in a very real sense the custodians of important national treasures, and it becomes your duty to share them with other Americans. But he goes on to say that Charleston needs to find a way to found an organization that could concentrate the responsibility for financing and carrying forth this area rehabilitation effort. So it was because of that in 1947, very shortly thereafter, and I think it was already sort of being developed, that Historic Charleston Foundation was founded by some of those same people I've been talking about, Albert Simmons, Samuel Gilliard Stoney, and Josephine Pinckney, and Judge Lionel Legg, and they were the initial founders and charter board members of this organization, which was supposed to set out to raise funds immediately and start buying derelict buildings. This is Frances Edmonds. She became director in 1948 and led the organization through part of my early time there in the 1980s. But the way the foundation...
Jonathan, sorry to interrupt. This might be a good time to launch just briefly into Betsy and Zoe's portion of the presentation.
Yeah. Can I just say one last sentence and then we can do it? Okay. So the foundation did this through its tours program and starting the Festival of Houses, what is today the Festival of Houses and Gardens. This is a house that Zoe knows well, that was on tour in the night. This is a little bit long before your time, Zoe, but in the late 1940s on tour. And this helped fund what the foundation would then come to do, which was to fight the demolition of key landmarks later that were outside the realm of the Board of Architectural Review, and to begin this outstanding revolving fund, which started with the Ansonboro neighborhood and then went on to other neighborhoods.
Yeah, Jonathan, thank you so much for laying that fantastic foundation about the origins of the Preservation Society of Charleston and Historic Charleston Foundation. So I'd love to take this time in the presentation and turn the floor over first to Betsy Cahill, chairman of the Preservation Society of Charleston. And then Betsy will be followed by Zoe Stevens, vice chair of the Historic Charleston Foundation. They will each share with us some of the current work that their organizations are currently undertaking as part of Charleston's current legal advocacy landscape. And then we'll have a chance to bring Jonathan back in for some, what I hope will be lively question and answer.
Okay, thank you, Will, and thank you, John. The Preservation Society is, as you can tell from its 1920 origin, celebrating its centennial this year. And it has been a year that has challenged us, but luckily we've really had 10 decades of challenges and difficulties and struggles to get through. So we've pivoted and adjusted, and we decided early on that we wanted to celebrate this milestone by securing the future of the organization, because really starting with Sue Frost, whose cousin Alston Days described her as being one step ahead of the sheriff because she was so overextended with her real estate. The history of the Preservation Society has been unrelenting feistiness, but a real lack of fiscal prudence. And so we have set about our first ever and 100 years campaign to secure the future of the organization and enable us to continue to be the strongest advocates we know how to be. And this really started about 5 years ago. The preservation landscape in Charleston changed pretty dramatically with a couple of events. One was the retirement of our 40-year mayor, Joe Riley, who had sort of been a one-man preservation decider in the city and had been a very, in many ways, strong preservation advocate. And also a lawsuit brought by a local developer against the BAR when a project it had put forth was denied. And ultimately, we in Historic Charleston locked arms to try and defend the BAR and prevailed, but in the end, the city settled rather abruptly. And it was then that we realized that the old ways of doing preservation weren't going to work anymore. We couldn't just show up to a BAR meeting the way that Frances Edmonds or Liz Young or Jane Thornhill did, say our piece and expect to have things go our way. So in the past 5 years, we have really focused on building up our relationships with all the stakeholders, from city council members to architects and developers, and trying to go up the chain a little bit to get better outcomes. We have expanded and increased our communications to our members. And we've expanded beyond, certainly beyond South Abroad a long time ago, but even beyond the peninsula to work in other neighborhoods which share some of the challenges to the livability and vitality of the city, whether it's sea level rise, which knows no boundaries. It affects really every community in this area, to poorly sited development, which contributes to flooding or traffic, to the depredations of mass tourism, which changed the economic equation in the city and changed the quality of life for people, not just directly affected by the carriages and the walking tours and the proliferation of hotels and short-term rentals, but just by the feel of the city and the traffic and the congestion coming into the city. So what we're hoping to do for another 100 years is to continue to expand our advocacy, to add some more advocacy staff, to add some technology tools we need, to assemble a little war chest for public relations or litigation. But I never grow tired of either talking about or hearing other people like Jonathan Poston talk about Susan Pringle Frost, because she really was a fighter and a ceaseless advocate for the residents of the city. And, you know, she's just revered around the Preservation Society. You know, probably perhaps more than she should be, but she was a remarkable person, and we sort of channel her spirit every day. So with that, I'm going to assume my 5 minutes are up and turn the mic back to Will.
Thank you, Betsy. I loved your use of the word, the term fighter, because that's a word I think that knits together Charleston's and New York's preservation communities. They're two of the, I'd say, handful in the country that really go to the mat to enforce local preservation law. And that's something I've always appreciated about both cities, that ability to, you know, to enforce law, to test law, to help develop the law. And, you know, as with New York, Charleston is very rich in preservation groups who are willing to play a role in that fight. Our next speaker is Zoe Stevens, who's going to share with us a little bit about what's happening at Historic Charleston Foundation today. So Zoe, we'll turn the floor over to you, and thank you for being with us.
Great, thank you, Will. And thank you also, Jonathan, for those beautiful slides and the comprehensive visual and historic story of Charleston's preservation movement. You did it great justice. Betsy outlined very clearly how the needs of preservation have changed pretty significantly in Charleston today. And while the issues and the threats have certainly changed, the need for watchful stewardship by committed citizens to preserve our built and our cultural character have not. Repeatedly being voted the nation's #1 tourist destination has created, sort of ironically, one of our biggest threats today. And in a familiar refrain from many concerns that were voiced in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s by both Preservation Society and Historic Charleston Foundation's sort of leaders and founders, that threat is unfortunately now also layered with another threat, which is flooding and being underwater. So while preservation is evolving from its traditional role of saving historic buildings to also addressing broader quality of life issues like affordable housing, mobility and transportation, tourism management, our focuses on advocacy, preservation, and education have similarly had to adapt. Since Jonathan mentioned Historic Charleston Foundation's revolving fund, and that's kind of where he stopped, I'll use that as an example of how we've had to shift some of our focus. And as an aside, one of the last slides that Jonathan showed was of my childhood house, which was purchased by Historic Charleston Foundation as part of its revolving fund. And although my parents weren't the highest bidders for that property at the time, the foundation knew them to be preservation minded and also knew that they would raise their family in the neighborhood, thus adding to that important sort of cultural quality of life. So I grew up sort of inherently indebted to the preservation movement of Charleston. The revolving fund sort of morphed over time and eventually stretched to protect the fabric of entire neighborhoods through purchases of individual buildings from demolition. As an example, the foundation's Ansonboro Rehabilitation Project rehabilitated more than 60 structures over a 12-year period. And with each structure that was purchased by the foundation, restrictive covenants and easements were placed on the dwellings, thus preserving them in perpetuity, or at least unless the laws are changed on a federal level. In 1955, Historic Charleston Foundation purchased the Nathaniel Russell House, which it used for both its offices and after a museum quality restoration as a museum house with a reinterpretation of the building and the grounds as a working urban landscape. It later acquired another museum house, the Aiken Rhett House, and today operates both of those as museum houses for fundraising and then also as anthropological laboratories for doing ongoing research into the lives and practices of people in those houses at the time. Today, Charleston's also grappling with the social equity implications of its economic success, and that sort of shows up in concerns over displacement and gentrification, while the character of historic neighborhoods in Charleston's Upper Peninsula continue to change dramatically. So although HCF is still using its revolving fund to rehabilitate houses in the historic district, it's significantly expanded its scope. It's urged a neighborhood revitalization impact initiative that focuses more on deteriorated properties with architectural merit and ensuring that long-term residences can stay in those places they called home. Of significance, it first attempted this in partnering with Charleston's Habitat for Humanity and the city of Charleston in its first rehabilitation of a freedman's cottage, and is now working to stabilize the North Central neighborhood, known for its historic freedman cottages and diverse vernacular architecture. Similarly, last year, the foundation assisted James Island's Soul Legree community, which was settled by freed enslaved peoples whose descendants still live in that area, in securing a listing on the National Register of Historic Places for Mosquito Beach. And that place is a vivid reminder of the segregation era, the last of 5 historic Black beaches in Charleston County remaining virtually intact. I don't want to go on. There's a lot that I could say about some of the changing initiatives. I'll speak quickly about, for example, how flooding has impacted preservation, but the foundation has gotten involved in spearheading an initiative for the Dutch Dialogues, which is essentially bringing experts from the Netherlands as well as other flooded areas in a strategic collaboration over water and how to address and deal with the rising levels of water as it impacts a historic district. So we've worked closely with the city in urging them to sort of move forward in that process. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more, but I know that I think my 5 minutes is well over, so I'll just stop there, Will.
No, thank you, Zoe. It's really illuminating, and it's fun, I think, and gratifying to see the work of Historic Charleston Preservation Society continue on into the 21st century. It's certainly a great honor to the founders of both organizations, and to remind me of a lot of the key groups in New York that have been part of so many important preservation battles there. So thank you. A special call out to Roberta Gratz, who's on the who's participating today as an audience member, but just wanted to call her out as one of my favorite preservation fighters and advocates. We could have a whole session with all of you today about her amazing work in New York and New Orleans. So Brad, if it's okay with you, we can move into the last portion of our time for some question and answers.
That sounds great, Will.
Brad is going to help us with fielding some questions. You're welcome to type them into the chat box. Is that correct, Brad?
That's right. And then we can lift them up from there.
Okay.
One question I had was, what really was the sort of the pivotal moment in terms of the legal regime in Charleston where like the legal teeth bit and there was a means of saving things through a legal mechanism?
Yeah, Jonathan, would you like to take that? I think just as a precursor, while Jonathan unmutes, we heard about some of the advocacy work that Betsy and Zoe's organizations are engaged in. One of the things that's always amazed me about Charleston's local ordinance is that it was passed in an era where there was no enabling legislation. From 1931 on, until there was an enabling law in South Carolina that allowed it, no one ever challenged that. And you know, New York, by contrast, passed theirs with full enabling legislation. So that's always been just a interesting issue for me. But I don't know, Jonathan, do you have any insights about some of the earliest preservation fight, or what started to give teeth to the local?
Well, I have to say that in those first decades after 1931, and I was always told by the city attorney who'd been in place for many years, that they just tried to always sit down with people and talk to them. If there was a controversy, that the Board of Architectural Review's first years under Colonel Austin Days, who was being mentioned earlier by Betsy and by others, that they would sit down with applicants and try to work things out. It was really that kind of process more than anything for those few decades. But then I think pivotally, and I can't remember the exact day, but it was probably in 1966, because of the passage of the National Preservation Act, a lot of things happened and began to happen just indirectly because of it, even though it was federal legislation. The demolition ordinance got strengthened. The historic district got expanded in 66 and again in 75 and again a number of times thereafter. And the Board of Architectural Review, and I think Zoe made a good point about how there hadn't been any, Zoe and Betsy were both talking about how there hadn't been any real losses for the city's preservation ordinance, and of course the city worked out this compromise, but it's not quite the same thing as what happened. Usually the right things for preservation happen to an extent. Now, buildings were lost to demolition. Those last slides I had were buildings that were lost in the 50s and 60s to demolition before those strengthening ordinances and anti-demolition process. So that's kind of key, that in the 60s and 70s, at least demolition could be denied. And eventually South Carolina passed some stronger enabling legislation for architectural review boards, et cetera. But those things were very ubiquitous at the beginning.
Can I just add a couple of comments to that? Albert, with regard to the 1931 zoning ordinance that passed the Charleston City Council, Albert Simmons was later known to say that if the city council members had actually understood what they were passing, they probably would not have voted for it. But, you know, even with regard to demolition, I believe both executive directors of both organizations today, this afternoon, while we're on this call, are attending virtually a city council meeting in which we are trying to stop the demolition of some historic smokestacks in a part of Charleston that usually doesn't require or ask for or get protection preservation. So it's the protection of preservation. So, you know, the more things change, the more they stay the same. These, you know, I loved what Zoe said about the need for watchful stewardship, because it is always there.
Mm-hmm. Will, we have a question from Cleary Larkin. Cleary, would you like to chime in and ask your question?
Have to unmute. Hi. I'm curious about Morris Knowles and why the city hired him. We know at this time there wasn't really a profession of historic preservation experts, and have you found out anything about his background or what his connection was to Charleston and why he was pulled in there? I've done some digging, but I haven't been able to find much about him myself either.
You know, that's a really great question. I don't know. Because it really, if you look up Morris Knowles today, they're more of a land survey planning firm. They're still in business, but they've been bought and, you know, changed. But I don't know. And I've wondered if that could be buried in some minutes of the society or the foundation, but well, it's pre-foundation. But I wonder if somebody obviously gave a recommendation, and it may have been that the city council minutes might reveal that Charles Hosmer wrote Preservation Comes of Age. Do you have access to that book?
I do.
That's a caller. Anyway, and it's a 2-volume history of preservation in America that the National Trust produced in the 70s. Hosmer really had a handle, and I seem to remember in that book, I don't have it, and I've read it so many years ago, but I seem to remember some discussion about Knowles and about their report, and it might be a little bit informative about that. And it might be a good archive research project that somebody in Charleston would do.
I think so. Thank you.
I wanted to note that John Bacon had not a question, but a note regarding Albert Simmons. John, if you're on, feel free to unmute and let us know your observation. I know I'm actually getting texts from a few people who had to leave or were forced to leave because a storm cut their internet. So yeah. John may be among those, but he noted, he said, was Stoney Albert Simmons' brother-in-law? Simon's nephew, Grange Simmons, was my cousin's husband. I'm very proud of his Charleston roots, though spent most adult life in New York until moving to Mount Pleasant in retirement.
There's such a close relationship, and actually the two women on the call for the organizations from Charleston will answer better than me, but there's such a close relationship between Simmons, between Stoney, Mayor Stoney, and very close with Stoney, the writer, so close cousins, and Albert Simmons as well. So very well could be. I'm a little shaky on that connection.
Jonathan, I would agree that it's very likely. I'm actually also related to Albert Simmons, which means that I may be related to the Stoneys. But I think if you go far enough back in Charleston, everybody's pretty much a connection.
Mm-hmm. Really?
So, but I think that sounds right to me without being able to put a definitive yes to it.
Okay. Mr. Wood, any additional questions that you had for our august lineup today?
Here we go, just unmuting here. No, this has been wonderful. Just one thought on the Morris Knowles thing is I'm wondering, I know that a number of national foundations helped fund some of the early work in Charleston in terms of surveys and the like, and I'm wondering if the recommendation might have partially come from the funder. But that we'll just add that for somebody else's future research. But anyway, no, this has been great. I'm glad we also got on the record that Charleston managed to do an awful lot of wonderful preservation work without having it needed in terms of stopping demo. I don't know if we know the exact date, but was that, do you know when that was actually given the power to stop demolition?
I used to know it when I worked at Charleston. I think it came in 66.
It did come in 66.
Is
Yeah,
it 66?
Yeah.
Betsy, okay,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Because it's interesting that Charleston was ahead in one of New York at one point, but then New York got the power to stop demolition in 65. So New York jumped Charleston on that one dimension, but the synergies between the two cities have been terrific. And I love the fact that the Charleston preservationists are particularly, focused on the legacy of a person that helps kind of make that there are others who came before us that can inspire us, and hopefully many others are going to come after us. So in New York, we have, our friends like our historic friends like Albert Bard and George McEnany and great historic figures. So it's wonderful to see another city lifting up their historic figures. And we were talking before this program started, and I think the next a statue of Miss Sue to put up somewhere in Charleston.
All right, thank you, Tony. And at this point, I just had one question for Jonathan, which is, since we weren't able to finish all of the remaining slides in your presentation, I know there are some folks in the audience who would like to be able to access that. Is there a way that you might be able to share that?
I'll work on that. I'm not sure, but I'll try.
Okay, and
Thanks.
if it's something as simple as sending a PDF to me for those who might inquire, we can certainly talk about that.
Well, thank you. I'll work on that. And just to say that the rest of it was pretty much this period of the 40s, 50s, and both Betsy and Zoe covered some of that very well that I would have said anyway. And I had a slide at the end of the flood water during the last hurricane, watching over the peninsula and leaving that, which has already been brought up. So another challenge.
Absolutely. Well, Will, I turn this over to you to round things out.
Yeah, well, just want to thank you for everyone for joining us. The New York Preservation Archive Project is thrilled that you were able to be with us today for the launch of our new series. And I look forward to being a participant in the future ones. So thank you, everybody, and a special thanks to Jonathan, to Betsy, and to Zoe for sharing their expertise and their vision.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank
All
you.
right, take care, everyone.